My name's Garrett Lenn Krosschell. Everybody calls me Lenny. I've been known as Lenn most of my life, or all my life. My mother was Tohunga Tuoro. She was married from the East Coast, Ngāti Porou. My father was Dutch. He was a Dutchman. They got married in 1952. I was born in 55. So I have our family, the Torah Family, a part of the Manuel dynasty in the East Coast. We're all descended from Jose Manuel. I think his last count was about 3,500 of us descended from him. From the early 1800s, he had 5 married wives and had children with 4 of them. So I'm part of that dynasty, really. And my great-grandmother and great-grandfather, they had a farm down in a place called Rangatukia, which is down the East Coast, not far from Tikitiki. They say that the Waipu's our river, Hukarang is our mountain, and the farm's still there. When the 2 brothers, Potene and Eruera, when they were living, they actually worked on the farm. It was a dairy farm. The family still have, I think the land was owned by our great-grandmother. She inherited the land from her family, because Rangiera was from the next town over, Ruatoria, which isn't too far away from Rangatukia. And so they worked the farm, that's how they survived. Rangatukia is a small place down the East Coast. And I'm proud that I come from there. I'm Ngāti Porou myself. I still have cousins living down there. And the 2 brothers, Eruera and Potene, they went away to war in the First World War. I think, who went first? I think the Eruera went first, and then later on Potene. But I think I can understand those boys signing up, adventure. That part of New Zealand's a small place. I think they saw an opportunity to sort of like go and look for a bit of adventure. They come over here, ended up here in this country, and then on the old Western Front. It's hard to say how they felt, but I would have thought it'd be a bit of a shock to the system, though. It wouldn't have been a nice place to ply their trade, but originally I think the Pioneer Maori Battalion were used as to dig trenches, build roads and stuff like that. I'm not too sure how much actual fighting they did on the Western Front, but I know they did do a bit, but how much they did I'm not too sure. My grandmother, her brother Wiremu Peka Hoia, he was also in the Pioneer Maori Battalion, and I found his grave in Bet de Court, which is near Albert. But I found his headstone and Eruera's headstone and Potene's. Why did I go looking for him? Well, when I was a small child, I was with my mother in the town of Turangi. That's where I grew up, in Turangi. And I was about 12 years old, and I remember being in the town centre with my mother, and I don't know how we got onto the subject, but she said to me one day that my grandfather had 2 brothers killed during the First World War and were buried in France. And this must have been in the 60s, would have been in the 60s. Then I arrived in England in 1980, and in 1988 I was driving around France in a car and I saw the sign, War Graves, Commonwealth War Graves. And that story that my mother told me about my grandfather's 2 brothers came back to me immediately, like she had told me the day before. So I went into the cemetery, but it was a Second World War cemetery. The little chapel, so I went and had a look in the little chapel, and they got these little visitors books, but in the book it says, you want any information to do with First World War and Second World War, ring this number in Maidenhead. So that's what I did. As soon as I got back to England, I rang Maidenhead and put up the name Tuoro, and they came up with Potene, and they said, yes, he's buried in the New Forest, row so-and-so, and I thought, oh, brilliant, Then I said, there's another brother, Tuoro brother, and they said, no, there's only one brother. So I thought, so I rang my mother, and she said, oh no, his name was Eruera. So I kept ringing him up and says, no, if he's there, his name will have his name. So we couldn't really work it out. My mother was insistent that there was definitely 2 brothers. But then she had a brainwave, because when those 2 brothers died, my great-grandparents had 2 more children, and they named those 2 children after 2 brothers that never came back from the First World War. And as it happens, Eruera's namesake was the youngest of my grandfather's family, and he was the last one alive out of all his brothers and sisters. And my mother rang him up. He was living in Wellington then, and she said, "Oh, my son's in England trying to find his other brother, Eruera." And he goes, "Oh no," he says, "Oh no, he changed his surname." I said, "What?" He says, "Yeah, he changed his surname to our original surname, which was Kafia, which we didn't know anything about." And which was a surprise to us all. So anyway, she rang me back and says, "Oh, have a look under Kafia." And so I rang up the War Graves Commission on Maidenhead, and they say, "Oh yes, he's buried in Armentières in France." So I got on my motorbike one weekend and shot over there and found the grave. And then my mother said, "Oh, your grandma," which was my whānau grandmother, Wiremu Pekahuia, he was killed in the First World War too. So I rang the War Graves Commission, and they told me where his headstone was too. So I went and visited it too. So I did the family pilgrimage. Portene, he died in Brockenhurst Hospital in Hampshire, and he died of TB. And I think it was prevalent amongst the Maoris in the early days, TB. So the Ngāti Pro people have been known to volunteer to fight for the British, if you like. The army have recruited a lot of Ngāti Pro, even during the Maori Wars. When the English were fighting some of the tribes in New Zealand, some of the Ngāti Pro actually fought with the English, but some of them fought against the English too. So but there's stories of like when the Boer War was on in South Africa. Maoris volunteered to fight, go to South Africa and fight for the English, but the English turned them down because they didn't like the idea of dark racist people shooting at white people. So some of these Maoris, is saying as they actually went over to South Africa and volunteered over there because they just I think genetically Maoris like to war anyway. So I think they would have thought about it. They volunteered to fight for the British, and there was a big war on, in Europe, and they thought, yeah, we'll volunteer because, they were asking for volunteers. I think life might have been a bit boring for them, I've worked on farms when I was a kid, go out and milk the cows, and so, life would have been a bit dull for them, really. And I think they took the first opportunity they could to get out and look for a bit of adventure. So for them, how would they have imagined coming over to Europe? I don't think they could have even fathomed that, that they would have had to sail on a ship for 2 months or anything like that. But I think it was just the adventure, just the idea of doing it, and every day being different, but they would have had to do the training first in New Zealand, and then they would have been shipped out. So I think every day for them would have been different to what they were used to, so every day was an adventure. I think originally the New Zealanders and Australians were heading for Europe, but then I think the British diverted them to the Suez Canal, and that's how they ended up in Egypt and that. And then Gallipoli, the Gallipoli came up, and because they were there, so they sent them to Gallipoli. But I think originally, when they originally left, they were heading for Europe, but then they got the troop ships got diverted to Egypt, and I think the Suez Canal came up, That's my understanding of the situation. When I first went down because I went down to New Forest, Brockenhurst first, and I went on my own, because I knew it was going to be emotional for me, and I didn't want to be around anybody. And I found the grave, and it was a real emotional moment for me. And I'm thinking, I didn't know, I'm not religious, but I wanted to say a prayer for him, a karakia, as we say in Maori, say a karakia, a prayer for him. And I had all these thoughts running through my mind, and I was trying to talk to the headstone, if you like, and saying hello and introducing myself, and it was a very emotional moment for me, and I was almost in tears, really. It was a very emotional time for me. I was almost blubbing away there, tears would come to my eyes, and I couldn't believe it that I found this ancestor of mine. So then after that, I was determined to find Eruera's headstone and Wiremu's headstone, and I did that 2 or 3 months later. One weekend I just think it was when the Channel Tunnel first opened up, I think. I just got on my motorbike about 4 o'clock one Saturday morning, shot over there, found him, and I was back by about midnight Saturday night. So, yeah, and that was pretty emotional too, because I told my mother that I was going to go over to Armentières and look for Erewa's grave. And at the time I had this carving, bone carving that I had from New Zealand. It was a manaia. And my mother knew that I used to wear this, so you know, she asked me, well, you know, when you get there, can you bury your manaia in this grave? And that's what I did, you know, which was pretty emotional too, you know, at the time when I did it. And those cemeteries are down there are sad places. There's a lot of young men in there, and there's a lot of them. There's a lot of cemeteries, you know, and you can't comprehend the numbers. You know, I've been to Tyne Commonwealth War Cemetery, and you just can't comprehend the headstones in there. And the other thing is, you know, it's 12. Well, I think it's 12,500 men in there, but 8,000 of them are unknown. You know, and that's incredible. You know, and there's still 35,000 out there in the field somewhere. So, and you think, well, you know, what did my ancestors go through? You know, what was it like for them? And I don't think it would have been easy for them. You know, and you know, I try and imagine how they felt at the time. You know, what do they go through emotionally? But you know, by that stage, they were, you know, in their own unit, they would have made friends with each other, and they would have looked after each other. Because Maoris do that; they look after each other, you know, and they help each other out, and they become a close-knit family. And you know, and if all the Ngāti Porou people were together, it didn't matter what tribe really, you know, but the Māoris, they would have been supporting each other through the hardships and that. But you know, they would have been having a good laugh during the good times too. So you know, so in Ypres there's 4 Pioneer Maori battalion guys buried there in the ramparts. And the story goes they got killed by a stray German shell, and they were actually doing a hangi. I don't know if you know what a hangi is. A hangi is where the Maoris cook food in the ground. And they were actually preparing a hangi when they got hit by a stray German shell. 4 of these Maoris, so they got killed, you know, doing this hangi. So I would have said, you know, my ancestors, they would have had a few hangis too. You know, every opportunity that, you know, they would have done that. So they were basically used as labourers initially, you know, digging trenches and that. I do know that, you know, the word digger was actually aimed at the New Zealanders originally, and that was near Caterpillar Valley, because the Pioneer Māori battalion were digging trenches there, and they were digging it so hard and fast that the English couldn't believe how quickly they were digging these trenches towards the front lines, German front lines, and somebody come over, look at, you know, there's those diggers. I don't know how the Australians got a hold of it, but it's sort of become an Australian word now. But I think, you know, I know what, you know, those boys, they would have worked hard all their lives. They would have been ingrained in them to work hard, been on a farm, and my understanding is my great-grandmother, you know, she was quite a tough woman. So those boys, you know, they'd know how to work, you know. My understanding is my great-grandmother didn't take any prisoners. You know, if you're there to work, you're there to work. And so they would have known how to work hard and just work diligently and get on with what they're supposed to be doing. So, and they would have formed a small team of guys together and worked together and worked hard. I suppose when you're working that hard too, you know, the dangers, you're not really thinking about the dangers, just thinking about what you're doing. And so, you know, back in New Zealand, they wouldn't have had a lot of luxuries, so they wouldn't have missed, you know, it's the old saying, isn't it? You know, what you've never had, you never miss. So, you know, they wouldn't have had too many luxuries back in New Zealand, so, you know, they wouldn't have had any in the First World War. You know, they would have just had the basics, so, and they wouldn't have known any better either. So they would have seen part of the world, you know, so it would have been good from Portinari, but I think Portinari, I remember looking at his war record, but I think he was ill from the beginning. I think he's, you know, the TB had, you know, he suffered from it right from the beginning, I think. But then again, for him, you know, he's doing things he would never have done ordinarily. So communication would have been just by letters, and I'm not too sure how literate the boys were. Although, you know, I think they would have had some sort of education in those days. Yeah, but you know, there's no records of him actually writing any letters.